All right, well, welcome to the last session of Change You. I feel like we've been through all 4 seasons, and we're ending our time together with beautiful sunlight and flowers and a lot of memories. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And I would like to send out a special thanks to Women and Gender Studies for the beautiful bouquet of flowers that arrived in the LGBT Resource Center today. Thank you to our friends for your support. And then I would also like to thank Amy and catering for these fabulous meals we've been having. Colorful too. Well, could I please have our students who are members of the Gender Neutral Housing Coalition stand up? I would like you to see some students who rock. Are getting it done at Grand Valley. They have worked with Student Senate to get a resolution passed in support of gender neutral housing. All right. Yes, that's right. And they have had consistent letters and articles in the Land Guard. They met with the Dean and Vice Provost, and they met with the Director of Housing, and things are just moving along in that direction. So give it up for gender neutral housing. Thank you to Dottie for her help, Dottie Rhodes for her help this week on coming up with some logos for gender neutral housing as well. Thanks for dropping everything and helping the coalition. And at this point, I also would very much like to remember to thank Arcus Foundation, the founder of the feast, literally, and the producer, actually the underwriter of Change You for all these months. And I want to take a moment, too, to thank our community members and faculty and staff. You know, we adore our students, and we try to make all over them 24/7, but community members and staff, you have availed yourself to be here with our students, and that has been such an impactful experience for you to be able to share your life experience, your wisdom, the journey that you've been on with them, and also to make the connection so that they have some opportunities out there to do some justice work in the community. So thank you very much. As we look over the last few months of Change You, I'm thinking about how it all started. We put a shout out about the program, and we crossed our fingers that we would have 50 applicants, and instead we had 150. Which put us into a funny space of, do we say no to people? Do we expand it? How do we do this? And so with some generous help from the Division of Inclusion and Equity, we were able to double the size and make it a program for 100 people. But also along the way, that changed the way that we rolled out the program. So originally we had talked about doing some projects. We didn't get to that because we ended up having a more diverse group with different experience doing justice work. And so we really set some world views out there during this time that we spent together. And tonight we'd like to open up a conversation about doing sort of a Change You 2.0 in the future. Arcus Foundation has contacted us and would be very interested in funding us again to do a basic level and then something else for people who want to do some deeper organizing with a smaller group of people. So we'll be having a conversation at the end of the evening asking you what that might look like. Maybe we have some mentor-mentee relationships because I know the students would be really interested in that as well. Let me take a moment before I introduce Lisa to recognize some of the staff. Is Paul in here?
Yes.
Paul, stand up. Our friend, our college student, Connie Bellows, our community liaison. And special special recognition and thanks to our program coordinator, Carrie Kirschner. So if you could just take a moment to check your cell phones and any other noise-making devices you might have with you and make sure they're turned off. We really appreciate it. And at this time, I'd like to invite up my good friend and the person who has really put together the curriculum for these many months, Lisa Wiener-Matthews.
Gosh, I can't believe this is the last one. It's amazing. It's great to be here with all of you today. Again, nice to have sun and warm weather too. And I'm especially pleased to introduce my really good friend, dear sister in the struggle here, Mia Mingus. And I want to tell you a little bit about her before I bring her up. Mia Mingus is a queer, physically disabled woman of color, Korean transracial and transnational adoptee, writer, organizer, and community caretaker. She's fierce. She was raised in St. Croix, spent 12 years in Atlanta, and has recently moved to Berkeley, California, where she continues to be fierce. Yes, yes. Through her work on disability justice, reproductive justice, queer liberation, and transformative justice, she recognizes the urgency and barriers for oppressed communities to work together and build alliances for liberation. She believes that love, care, and kindness are political. And through her work for liberation, as her work for liberation changes and evolves, her roots remain firmly planted in ending sexual violence. Fierce feminist we have here, womanist. Mia was co-executive director of SPARK Reproductive Justice, SPARK Reproductive Justice Now until January 2010. She is a founding member of the Disability Justice Collective and was a member of the Atlanta Transformative Justice Collaborative for 4 years. She is currently part of the experimental project To the Other Side of Dreaming to document her journey creating collective access in home, and she's going to talk a little bit about that tonight. Very powerful work. Mia was a 2005 New Voices Fellow, was named one of the Advocate's 40 under 40. In 2000, that was in 2010. In 2009, she was named the 30 most influential Asian Americans under 30. And that was, she was named by Angry Asian Man, right? And yeah, exactly. And she's also been named Campus Pride's top 25 LGBT favorite speakers for their 2009 Hot List, and hot she is. Mia was honored with the 2008 Creative Change Award by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and she was also a Unity and Community Award awardee, awarded by the Unity Fellow of Christ Church in Atlanta, is that right, Mia? And Community Activist Award for her dedication and steadfast activism in 2007 by Zanny. So she has been making her way around the country, speaking, organizing, and being in conversation with folks all over the country around these really important issues, and I'm really thrilled she's here tonight to talk to all of you. So let me bring up my good friend and dear sister, Mingus.
Is it on? Hello?
Nope.
Hello? He said turn it all the way.
Okay, we're just gonna have
A little. Hello?
oh, that's.
Oh, it's just for you. Oh.
Ah.
Hello? No, I'm just kidding.
So does she have to stand at the podium?
I'm gonna. But it's okay, it's working, right? Can you all hear me? No, okay.
Here's the lavalier.
So we should do two.
Yeah. Set mode.
I think it's up at the top.
Yeah.
On.
There we go. Yep, there you go. You're live.
Well, I feel like
There
I'm
you
on a reality TV show.
Yes, I know.
Okay.
Do you wanna hold
Does that
it?
work? Can you all hear me now? Better? Okay, well maybe I'll put it right here. Is that better? Okay. Hi. Yes, I can. No, I think I can use it because I'm going to try to use the laser pointer, which I'm really excited about. I'm going to see, though, if I can do this because I like to use my hands. I do feel like I'm on a reality TV show. Okay. Whoa. All right. Hi. I'm going to stay away from electrical outlets and all things electric. So it's so lovely to be here with you all. How are you all doing? Good. Yes, oh, that's good too. So I am going to talk with you all tonight about disability justice and reproductive justice. And actually we're going to start with reproductive justice and then go into disability justice. And I know we have 2 hours, which is not a lot of time to cover one of those. And I know that you all have been doing some amazing work. I feel so honored to be going after so many wonderful, smart, brilliant folks. But what I wanted to leave you all with tonight, especially since we have limited time, is really a sense of these frameworks, the reproductive justice framework as well as the disability justice framework, which I think complement each other so well. And when we talk a little bit about the history of the movements, they also complement each other well. Because I think bringing this lens forward in your work is probably going to be what will be most helpful. Because the laws change from state to state. There are different conditions according to where you live geographically, what community you're a part of, and we can't possibly cover every single piece of it. But most definitely want to get to just the larger framework, because I think that will be what will be most lasting. And I know that this is like building the knowledge base straight up. They're telling me, they're like, people take out their papers and pens and they just write everything down. I love that. I'm so excited. I'm going to try this. Oh, can you all see that? Oh, yes. Yes. Okay. Okay, great. So let's see if this works. Great. So we're going to start with what is reproductive justice, and I'm going to go fast. If there are any larger access needs, are there any larger access needs in terms of pace or anything like that? If I am going too fast, which I do when I get excited, just kind of give me a little wave, and I'll try to slow it down for folks in the room. Yes?
And we'll upload this up on our video for everybody to have.
Oh, great, great. Okay, so what is reproductive justice? In the beginning, what activists started to grapple with was that it was reproductive health plus social justice. That's kind of like in its simplest terms, this is how people began to think about reproductive justice. And reproductive justice was coined by women of color. So they were really grappling with how do we explain what it is that we're trying to put forth in the world. That we're not just talking about health services, but we're also talking about the social conditions that surround those health services. The right to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children that one has with dignity. And this actually came out of Sister Song, which is Women of Color for Reproductive Freedom, the only women of color collective that there is. They're based out of Atlanta, Georgia. And this is how one of their big definitions or pillars of reproductive justice. So the right to have children, meaning that for a lot of women of color in particular, a lot of poor folks, it wasn't about the right to not have children. We were fighting to keep the children that we had. We were fighting to even be allowed to get pregnant, fighting to become parents. And so then also to not have children and to parent the children one has with dignity. And that, again, was speaking to the larger social conditions. So what good does it matter if you can have a child if I won't be able to afford health care for them, if I won't be able to feed them, if they're living next to a landfill, if they're going to be raised just to be funneled into the prison industrial complex. All of these issues were what reproductive justice activists were starting to put forth. The last one is that we believe reproductive justice will be achieved when all people have the economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our gender, bodies, and sexuality for ourselves, our family, and our families and our communities. And that's from Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, and that is their definition of reproductive justice. So you can see as the reproductive justice movement has evolved, it getting more and more complex as we have been reaching out to more and more activists thinking about what is it that we're actually trying to fight for, and that it starts to encompass things like gender and bodies and sexualities. And I'm going to get farther in to this. So very quickly, the reproductive rights, health, and justice movements. This was put forth by Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice in 2005 from their paper, A New Vision for Reproductive Justice. And it was the first place that really outlined these three specific movements. A lot of the time, people would say reproductive choice or say reproductive rights, and everything would just get collapsed into each other. And what Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice did, along with others, but they were the one who put out this paper, and I think spearheaded the initiative to get it documented, was to outline these three different distinct approaches that were happening, that still are happening, which I think helps us to distinguish where the gaps are in the work that needs to be done. So we're going to start over here with reproductive rights. So how many folks have heard of the pro-choice movement, or that term? Yeah, right? It has been one of the most successful slogans of all movement history across all movements. Pro-choice. You can go very few places, and most people will have heard of what you're talking about. So they coined that slogan, right? Pro-choice, and the reproductive rights movement was very, very focused on abortion. So sometimes I'll say the pro-choice movement and the reproductive rights movement, same thing. So I might sometimes say either one. Very, very heavily focused on abortion, and they were grounded in a legal advocacy-based model. So their idea of how to change things was you look to the courts and the government for change. If you asked a reproductive rights activist, what can I do? What should I do to impact things? Where should I go? They would say, talk to your representatives, sue somebody or get a court case together to challenge a policy or an amendment. They were looking to the courts and the government and policymakers for protection, for change. It was grounded also in a woman's individual right to privacy, and this is where this whole notion of choice started to come from. And you would hear things like my body, my choice, right? It's a decision between a woman and her doctor, right? This whole notion of right to privacy, that it should be taken out of the court's hands and put into the individual's hands. And again, it was very focused on the right not to have children. Sometimes it would expand from abortion to include family planning or like birth control, but largely always, all the time, about the right not to have children, which makes sense because when you think about the people who were in leadership in the reproductive rights movement, it was largely white women, middle class to upper class women, heterosexual women, folks who were encouraged to have children, right? Encouraged to be reproducing. And so when you think about it in that context, it did make sense that if those were the people who were making the decisions, who had the power, that they would be fighting for the right not to have children, to be able to control their reproduction that way. That was what control looked like for them and what sovereignty looked like for them. Now, this is not to say that they were the only people doing that work. Queer folks, women of color, young people, we have always been doing this work. We just weren't given the power, the institutional backing, or the visibility. So the icons that you hear from the reproductive pro-choice movement, right, or the feminists that you hear about, there are a lot of white folks, a lot of white women in particular. You don't necessarily hear the stories of women of color out of the reproductive rights movement, even though we were doing the work. So under here at the bottom are some of the challenges with all three of these movements. So the first big challenge to the reproductive rights movement that ACRJ, as well as other reproductive justice activists outlined, was this idea of choice. Who has choices and who doesn't? Not everybody has choices. And what RJ folks would point to is that for a lot of people, they don't have the luxury or the privilege of having the right to privacy. So if we're fighting for choice, and not justice, then we would be fighting to have access to maybe 12 decisions between birth controls. Not necessarily are all of those birth controls going to be dangerous. Are they all going to give you harmful side effects? Might some of them end up sterilizing you? And so RJ activists started to draw a distinction between choice and justice, that we didn't just want to fight for choice based in consumer, right? A consumerist choice. I want to be able to pick out my birth control like I want to be able to pick out what laundry detergent I use. We actually want to think about justice, because for a lot of folks, they didn't even have a choice. Their only choice was whatever was free at the free clinic that they were going to, right? Whatever was free at the college campus clinic on the college campus that they were at. The other piece was the privilege of access to the courts, the government, and privacy. Again, right? Who has access to those spaces? And that for a lot of people and a lot of communities, we don't look to the courts and the government as places that will keep us safe. We actually look to the courts and see the courts and the government as places that we need to be kept safe from. For a lot of folks, they're making the distinction of this is all well and good, but there are a lot of us who don't see that as being a place for change, because it never really has, and it has ended up hurting us more than anything. So I want to make a quick distinction too before we move on to health, that it's not to say that any one of these is better or worse. It's more to just draw the distinctions, right? That there are very real threats that are coming down the pipe that we have to be mindful of when it comes to policy change. Of course, not all of us have the privilege or the access to get to that, to make those changes, but that's really important to note. Especially for those of us who don't have a choice of whether or not the state is in our lives. People who rely on welfare, people who rely on their SSI checks, people who don't have that kind of like, well, I can just go to my personal doctor, my private doctor to get things done. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. So the second one is reproductive health. And this was grounded in a service delivery model. This is where you'll find your providers, your health researchers, and the reproductive health movement was mainly about ensuring access to reproductive and health services and accurate health information and education. This is where the folks who were working on the immediate needs of the community, this is where you would find them. If you asked a reproductive health person, how do I make change? They would say you have to be down in the clinic, giving women birth control, teaching them how to use condoms, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is really what it was about, but the problem was, because they were focusing mostly on the immediate needs of communities, they didn't have the capacity to also focus on the root conditions of why those needs were coming up, right? They couldn't. It's not to blame them, it's to say that they couldn't even reach all of the people who actually need help. How are they also supposed to work on the root causes of inequality? And because they don't address the root causes of inequality, it's just responding and responding and responding. And it is a very exhausting and probably one of the hardest jobs that we have. Folks, we'll talk about it like these folks are in the trenches. So the last one is reproductive justice. And this is grounded in organizing communities to change conditions which allow for reproductive oppression in our lives. It's rooted in grassroots organizing. It's a justice framework that wants to go beyond choice and actually talk about justice, right? If my only two choices are harmful forms of birth control, for example, then that I might have a choice, but it's not just. If I have to choose between going to the doctor or feeding my children, that's a choice, but it's not just. The reproductive justice activists automatically at ground level baseline had an understanding of population control, that some populations were being encouraged to produce and some populations were being discouraged from reproducing, which automatically framed why we also have to have the right to have children and to not have children, as well as the right to parent. It automatically understood that controlling women's reproduction was about controlling communities. It took it away from the individual, this single woman, and brought it to this woman is actually connected to legacies of women like her, connected to other women who are like her in her neighborhood right now, connected to her grandmother, her mother, connected to the global south, right? And had an understanding of intersecting systems of oppression because it was coined and created by women of color, had a baseline of understanding that we have to talk about white supremacy, we have to talk about male supremacy and economic exploitation and all of the other systems of oppression if we're going to understand what reproductive oppression looks like. And in particular, I think what is important and what I hope is happening and continues to happen is that those most affected are at the center. So in the reproductive justice movement, the leadership looks completely different. You'll see queer women of color, you'll see queer folks, trans folks, you'll see young people, sex workers, across the board. It's a much, much more diverse kind of leadership that you'll see, and a lot of that spoke directly to the fact that these are a lot of the communities who, one, don't even have access to the courts like we talked about, and two, aren't looking to the courts for change, and that this was a large gaping hole in just, initially what was just these two approaches, that there needed to be something else here that we were some other kind of work that we were doing. And of course, some of the huge, I guess, problems or challenges that we face in the reproductive justice movement is that it's challenging folks on a personal and a political level, that it's very, very deep kind of work. It's not just show up for this voting campaign or sign this petition. It's actually changing the way in which you live, and that is much, very, very different kind of work. And then on top of that, doing political work, external political work. It's about confronting power head on, and of course, the sustainability of long-term work. Like, what does it take to sustain somebody to end white supremacy, to end violence against women? That kind of sustainability is very, very hard to keep up. Making sense? Good? Okay. It's like so dirty and fast. So that was what the approach was, right? But what are we actually talking about when we say reproductive justice? Just to be clear so that you all know as we move forward tonight. So this has come out of my work with SPARK Reproductive Justice Now. This is what we have used and how we define what reproductive justice actually is. And I'm going to start with these triangles and go fast. So this first triangle would encompass things like comprehensive sex education, gynecological health would be in here, reproductive health, HIV and AIDS, STDs, infos, and services would all live in this triangle. It encompasses things like abortion, emergency contraception, birth control, right, the right to not have children. It encompasses birthing rights and prenatal care and midwifery. It encompasses assisted reproductive genetic technologies. Does everybody know what that means in this room? Some people know? Okay. So assisted reproductive genetic technologies, so let's just take out the genetic piece for a second. Assisted reproductive technologies are things like in vitro fertilization, right? Sperm and egg banks, things like that. If we add in the genetic piece, assisted reproductive genetic technologies, that's where we're actually starting to look at the actual genes that people are selecting. So that's where you get to like designer babies. Some of you might have seen it in like airplane magazines. They're like, ooh, you want a girl, you want a boy, you can pick the IQ. You can say, I want my daughter to have blue eyes, right? You can say, I want them to have this kind of a disposition. I mean, all of this, of course, we know. It's very hard to select a gene for a disposition, but this is what's being marketed, right? The other piece, too, is that there's also inheritable genetic modification traits that are happening, which means that you could say, I want my daughter to have blue eyes, and I want her children to have blue eyes, and I want their children to have blue eyes. And that's like an example of something they're working on. This also encompasses things like when rich folks buy or purchase or have frozen indigenous folks' DNA, for example, and then try to do tests on them, or sometimes indigenous people's whole bodies, and try to do tests on them. So it encompasses all of that. And a lot of this right here that's happening, not regulated, it's happening at the very, very, the folks who are very, very rich in our society, exploiting the folks who have very, very little money. Like in India, there's a growing underground market for folks who are carrying rich women's babies in their wombs, right? And that's like becoming a big thing. And of course, they're told when to sleep and eat and what to do and what kind of music is playing and shot up with vitamins and everything, and there's all kinds of human rights violations. So that would be all of those things to be included in assisted reproductive genetic technologies. This next one, triangle, would be family, right? And we consider family to be broad, not just biological family, but also chosen family, situational family. So this triangle would be the right to parent, which would include adoption and foster care. And of course, that these two things, these triangles don't operate on their own, right? They operate in concert to each other, especially when we know that adoption is one of the biggest kind of alternatives offered by the religious right as a way to fight abortion. But if we're not looking at what goes on in the foster care system, especially here in the United States, then we're losing a big picture. piece of the picture. So, and then this last one would be sexuality, pro-sex, gender, queerness, and bodies was what we would include, because we can't talk about reproductive justice without talking about sexuality. We can't talk about it without talking about bodies. And that all of these triangles, all of these pieces of reproductive justice, which actually is so large, happen against a backdrop instead against the context of these larger conditions like fear, eugenics, medicalization, violence, population control, which we're about to get into, and oppression, different systems of oppression. And eugenics, of course, being something that's not historical, that's still happening now. Which traits are considered more valuable, and then, of course, whoever has those traits more encouraged to produce, to reproduce, et cetera, et cetera. Making sense? Yeah? Okay. I'm going to take a sip of something.
I'm going to get you some more.
Okay. Great. So just quickly, and of course all of these things, this would be an example of some of the systems of oppression. You all, I know, are familiar with them. We're not going to go through them. We don't have time, but to start thinking about how all of these different systems of oppression interact with reproductive justice, as well as different movements, right? We think about, for example, what birthing rights for women who are incarcerated look like. When we think about war and militarization, folks who are anti-war militarization as connected to right to parent, especially for folks in countries where bombs are falling from the sky and things like that. Okay, so population control is something that I think is really a key piece to reproductive justice, to understanding it, and I'm going to read these quickly. So overpopulation is often proclaimed as the root of all global problems. Journalists and public policy experts claim that crises ranging from civil war in Rwanda to deforestation in the Amazon are the results of overpopulation. That's from the Committee on Women, Population, and the Environment. That's from their website. They're no longer in existence, or they're on a hiatus. They're figuring things out right now. But basically, population control, as we're talking about it, is very different than the ways in which it's being presented, right? We would say, reproductive justice activists would say that it would argue versus the more people equal fewer resources piece, and we would actually say that it's more about redistribution and resources. That we cannot blame women of color's fertility for social conditions that are being created. And actually that there is enough resources and food to go around for folks. It just needs to be redistributed in a different way. And if some folks would stop using, more than their fair share, then we actually would have resources to go around. And it's in no way, shape, or form saying that we're anti-environmentalists. It's actually drawing distinctions between the environmental rights movement and environmental justice movement. Similarly to reproductive rights and reproductive justice, that the environmental rights movement has been a very racist and classist movement, and environmental justice activists, sometimes climate justice activists is what they're called, are communities of color fighting for a different version, not conservation, but actually how do we think about communities in relationship with the land in a different way that's not just to conserve it for recreational purposes or consumerism. This next one, women of color's fertility, particularly women of African, Asian, and Latin American descent, and women living in developing nations, is framed as the root of the problem. And the last one, population control programs are public and private programs that are explicitly designed to drive down the birth rates of certain groups of people, particularly in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, usually through the aggressive promotion of sterilization and long-acting contraceptives. So this is drawing a global picture for us, but of course we know that this happens here in our country as well on a smaller level, domestically. And I want to point to this, population controls are public and private, to note that it's not just state-run programs, but it's also programs that have been started by rich folks like CRAC. Children requiring a caring community was started by a very rich woman who decided she wanted to go into particularly poor urban areas and pay women who were drug users $200 to get their tubes tied, right? And she had enough money that she was able to do it, and it became this huge kind of initiative that she did that was all over the nation. So does this make sense in terms of population control, that we seriously want to challenge the myth of overpopulation, which is not to say that we are, again, anti the environment. It's actually to make that more complex and that we are environmental justice. Environmental justice has to be part of reproductive justice, but we want to look at who's being targeted by the myth of overpopulation. Okay. So just really quickly, that we also have a broad understanding of population control. What we first slide in particular was more specific roots of the specific roots of population control, but that all of these systems, of course, are part of controlling populations, right? We think about the prison industrial complex and how it controls, in particular, men of color's fertility, right? And how much time they spend in the prison industrial complex. Some of these are pretty self-explanatory: sexual violence in the medical industrial complex. Is it making sense, folks? Yeah. And so largely we're just talking about how communities are controlled and connecting controlling women's fertility to controlling their community's fertility and their community's reproduction, right? The control of one person's reproduction is actually about the control of a whole community. Okay, so that was reproductive justice, quick and dirty. So this is disability justice, and one of the places that I want to start with is the medical and social model, because I think when we begin to think about disability, one, it's one of the places where most people know the least about, even folks who are seasoned and they know about reproductive justice or racial justice, they know about queerness, they know a little bit about feminism, but most folks don't really have that much grounding in disability justice or thinking about disability as a political experience. So I'm going to go over the medical model and then the social model. And most people who start doing anything in disability, I think the medical model is a great place to start and a great entry point. So in the medical model, first of all, just wipe out that social model part first. This was pretty much all we had before the disability rights movement. And in the medical model, disability is grounded in medicine and science, right? Disability is defined by your impairment. It's defined by how the medical industry or how medicine and science define your disability. So define you, I should say. So I'll use myself as an example. I have polio. So polio would be my disability under the medical model of disability, right? And a lot of people draw distinctions between impairment versus disability. So impairment being something that's purely descriptive, like for me, I have a weaker right leg, might be my impairment, right? But that my disability is actually, well, in this sense, would be that I had polio, but that my disability actually comes into play when I start bumping up against the world. That I'm not disabled until I start moving through the world, and that would be in the social model. That disability is defined by access and oppression. But I'm jumping ahead of myself. In the medical model, it's grounded in the individual, and it's very much about your disability is like an individual flaw or tragedy. It's on you to be making sure that you're taking your medication, that you seek the care that you need. It's on you to make everybody else feel comfortable, and this is where the individual body is seen as wrong. So it's not the world that's wrong, it's your body that's wrong, and you need to fix your body to be able to be in the world better. In the social model, which was what came about through the disability rights movement, the social model was grounded in social conditions and power and privilege. And it was much more about the collective. It was not this individual, but it was actually starting to connect to, you'll start to hear about disability culture, right? And that there's whole communities of disabled folks. And it was grounded in, you'll hear things like the world is wrong. It's not my body that's wrong, it's when I come in contact with the world. It's not that I have a weaker right leg, it's that things aren't made accessible for me. Things are made for certain bodies. And if they were made for bodies like me, I would not be disabled. Is that making sense? Yeah? And my disability was then defined by access and oppression. That's how they started to define disability. And one thing to note about this was that, first of all, to move from here to here is a huge shift for people. And it was a huge shift when it happened. It's still a huge shift as the disability rights movement and I would say disability change movements still continue. It was an enormous shift to even begin to think of disability as not just individual, but something that could be thought of as collective. An enormous shift to begin to look at social conditions as a place that constructs disability. one thing that I would say from a disability justice perspective is that we don't want, neither one of these is the end-all be-all. Neither one of these fully encapsulates disabled people's lived experience, and I would say our whole full lived experience. And what we want to do is actually complicate this. We don't want to just say, whoa, the social model's here, this is everything. Forget the medical model, it's horrible, it's oppressive, and it is horrible and oppressive. And at the same time, we don't want to forget our bodies. You know, I always say, we can swing through the air in a vine screaming socially constructed all we want to all day long, but eventually we hit a wall, and I believe that that wall is our bodies. Chronic pain is real, right? Our bodies and the limitations that our bodies have is real, and it's not just the world that we live in. We also have to also talk about our bodies. And we can't just pretend that if all buildings were accessible and if every great policy was passed, that there would be that we wouldn't have to worry about disability anymore, because we would. What does it mean when somebody can't use the bathroom by themselves? And it's not just about that there's not accessible bathrooms, but it's actually speaking to something much deeper, which we're going to get into. Does that make sense? Yeah? So we want to complicate it. Because, and the other piece that I would add here is that when the social model came out, ableism was so severe, and which is not to say that it's not severe now, but it was so severe because nobody had ever heard anything like this, that to even push the resistance against the medical model was so much. To even just say what they were saying was a huge shift. And now that they've done that, because of the work that they have done, we have a little bit more space to be able to hold, sometimes I don't like having a disability. And it's not about me hating myself. It's actually about real things that are happening in my body. Where are those conversations? How can we have those conversations? So a little bit, okay, so you're like, whoa, give me a warning before that happens. So the medical model, to give you an idea, we're going to go into the medical industrial complex, and the medical model was grounded in the medical industrial complex because people had to kind of smush themselves into these narrowly defined medical definitions of what their bodies were, right? That's all that you were in the medical science world. You were just whatever medicine and science described you as. It meant that you were also, oftentimes, not only does the medical model happen within the medical industrial complex in particular, but that then you were having to interact with it, you were having to force yourself back into systems and definitions that maybe you wanted to escape. And so to just give you all a sense of what I'm talking about, when I say the medical industrial complex, we're going to look at this slide because I think it's important, because I don't think that a lot of folks really understand what the medical industrial complex is. I feel like I'm like speed drinking. What the medical industrial complex is and how many different branches it has. Okay, there we go. So this is something that we have come up with, myself in collaboration with Patty Byrne and Kara Page, came up with this about a year or two ago. And we don't have time to go through everything in it, but just to give you all a sense of what we're talking about, what I'm talking about when I say medical industrial complex. So we've broken it down. I mean, obviously we could go through ableism and science and eugenics, but I want to just get into these bolded squares right here, which are kind of the branches, the overarching larger branches of the MIC. And of course, there might be more. This is a living document. It's breathing. We probably will add more things. I have no idea how it's going to fit on this piece of paper, but we'll figure that out. So over here we have biocolonialism, which includes assisted reproductive genetic technologies, because again, the traits in particular that are getting deselected are oftentimes disabled traits, right? And of course, this is hand in hand with eugenics as well, because oftentimes people are also choosing, there's a lot of white supremacy in the traits that are being deselected or selected, right? Like I want blue eyes or blonde hair. But then population control and sterilization would live there, as well as this is where your scientists and your researchers would live. Another branch would be the nonprofit charity organizations that exist, and particularly because a lot of them do service provision and a lot of them do direct service as well. Another branch would be New Age energy or healing, right? That there's a lot of faith-based healing out there that's that's very oppressive to disabled folks in particular, not just disabled folks. That it would even include things like practitioners and leaders of New Age energy and healing movements. This one we're struggling with even the name for it, but disability equipment field loosely, which would include all kinds of prosthetics and braces and mobility, physical therapy, things like that. There's been talk that physical therapy might even have to be its own branch. But then we would have assisted living here, which directly intersects with elderly and people particularly who are physically disabled. Pharmaceutical companies would be here, mental health, which would include therapy and psychology, and especially public and private institutions, right? When we think about folks who are in state and private mental health institutions. And then last but not least, we have state and private hospitals, clinics, and centers. And this is where you'll find your doctors, your nurses, your practitioners, medical schools would be in here. And that all of these, of course, are kind of connected by and understood in the context of capitalism, trauma, violence, these conditions, colonization of bodies. But does that help give you all a better sense of what we're talking about? So, and I think when you talk about disability justice, you can't not talk about the medical industrial complex, because it is one of the main sites where disability gets constructed and where disability oppression happens. Oh, it's so strange to go through this and not have any questions. You all get it automatically, I know. Okay, so we're going to talk about disability movements now, which are similar to the ACRJ chart that we first saw with reproductive rights, health, and justice. Similar to that, this is something that I've come up with that I think is really handy in terms of understanding disability movements, because disability also gets collapsed in as all one thing, and there's actually lots and lots of different things happening. Too many things happening. Okay, so I'm calling it disability services because I don't think that we're even in a place yet to be able to understand health without it to understand health that's not in an ableist context. So disability services, oh, I haven't even been using this. Disability services is grounded in a service delivery model. Again, similar to the reproductive health movement, right? These are folks that are working on meeting the immediate needs. This is where you'll find, the caseworkers that you have to go to, the people that approve benefits, state benefits, and things like that. The folks who are actually giving out medication to people. And here I just have the people that are working in it, because we've already gone through kind of what make up these different ones in the beginning with the reproductive rights, health, and justice. That this is made up, in this disability services movement, which you'll find, or industry, is able-bodied folks, a lot of parents of children with disabilities, professionals, people who know disability, they're the experts, of course they're not disabled. A lot of folks with class privilege, and the disability services industry definitely grounded in a medical model, and oftentimes intertwined with the medical industrial complex, right? The disability rights movement, what I've been talking about, grounded again similarly, right, in a legal advocacy-based model, as well as a rights equality-based model, which I would say is very similar to the reproductive rights movement. But here you see it even more. So you'll hear things like, disabled people deserve rights just like everybody else. We're just like you, we just have a disability. We feel joy too, we can be parents too, I go to work too, like all of these kind of sayings, which is kind of ridiculous to me because I don't understand what the push is. But I think it is about more of a rights equality-based model of saying that we can be just like you, and that's what we want to be, right? And I think disability justice would totally push back against that and say, actually, we don't want to be just like you. It's not based in an assimilation model, right? That we are different, and that's good. We like it. And actually, to be just like you requires people's exploitation and oppression. We don't want to just join the ranks of the privilege. We want to actually start to dismantle what that privilege looks like and think about redistribution, think about justice for everybody. In the disability rights movement was largely, again, the folks who were visible, the people who had the power, the kind of like icons of the disability rights movement. A lot of white folks, a lot of men, people who were assigned as male at birth, a lot of veterans. Even though veterans don't really make up that much of the disability population, they got a huge amount of attention in the disability rights movement. And I think that veterans actually play a really interesting and particular role in the disability movement because of how their disability came to be, right? And so it's like a whole nother part of our social consciousness. A lot of folks, again, with class privilege who had the access to be able to fight in the courts, to be able to fight legal battles, to be able to push for, well, my child should get to be in the AP classes, whatever it was. Grounded geographically, just to note that it was a lot of the work took place in DC and in Berkeley, California. A lot of people think of Berkeley, California as the birthplace of the disability rights movement. A lot of people with physical disabilities, people who were like well-spoken, so not a lot of folks with cognitive disabilities necessarily, or people who had speech impediments or anything like that. And grounded in the nonprofit industrial complex, some people call it the DIS biz, right? So it was very much began to start looking at how to profit off of this movement, off of fighting for the rights of folks with disabilities. And again, here you'll also find a lot of people who are able-bodied as well. One thing to note is that these two movements have a significant amount of able-bodied people. This movement definitely has more disabled people, much, much more. But still, and I think that speaks to where the shift is again in disability justice. So in disability justice, similar to reproductive justice, we want to ground it in community organizing, right? We want to ground it in justice and liberation. It's a justice framework. And so it's not just, like I said, looking to the courts and the government for change. We're actually looking at all the folks who fall through those cracks, all the folks who don't see that as a path to social justice. So a lot of people of color, women of color, queer folks, trans folks, poor and working class and low income folks, folks with psych histories, cognitive and mental disabilities, immigrants, disabled parents, youth. We could go on and on. Sex workers, drug users, et cetera, people who are self-medicating. And I think it is important to note that even though this is where what is seen as when people talk about disability rights, it's this movement, but this is actually where most of the people with disabilities are. And I think we have to start thinking about, well, one, because this is where people are for their daily survival, right? They're getting their meds, they're getting whatever it is that they need to just get through the day because of the severity of ableism. Right? And that so the people who are able to do this kind of advocacy, I think it does start, we do need to start asking serious questions around class in particular, around race, around age and ability. Is that all making sense to folks? Yeah? Okay. Also and I should have said this with the reproductive justice, health and justice and rights slide. These are not mutually exclusive. So there's some organizations that do both. There's some groups that do maybe one. Same is true for reproductive rights, health and justice, right? Like Planned Parenthood is a great example. They do advocacy and they also have clinics, right? So they're doing health and rights. There's folks now who are struggling with how to do reproductive justice and public policy, and I think that they're kind of amazing to figure out how to hold that. But I think what's interesting to note in both of those larger movements is just how similar rights and equality-based movements are and why that is, and the need for justice movements. And that justice movements have been popping up everywhere, right? The queer liberation movement, folks who are working in economic justice, and why there is such a need for that. And it speaks to how we have conceptualized activism, and disability justice, I think more than anything, gets to that. How we've conceptualized activism and what change looks like, and who's gotten to dictate what gets seen as activism and what gets seen as change. Yeah? Okay. I always make you move your foot.
No, it's okay. I should actually.
Okay. So, just quickly, places where disability get constructed. And this is, I would say, is definitely part of a disability justice analysis, that we start to begin to connect how disability, or how I should say ableism, gets leveraged in service of all these different systems of oppression, right? That ableism, oftentimes through violence, gets leveraged in service of white supremacy, in service of global capitalism, in service of male supremacy. So war and militarization, dangerous and unsafe working conditions, access to unhealthy food and unclean water, or even no food and water, environmental racism, cycles of violence, prison industrial complex, the medical industrial complex, of course. And here is that we're also where we start to get in some of the more sticky places where I think only a disability justice framework can help us to hold. So things like, How do we make it so that disabled people of color do not become the poster children for environmental racism, so that we don't become the reason why there needs to be no environmental racism, right? How do we make it so that abortion activists are not using ableist rhetoric to fight for abortion and not saying I need to have access to abortion so that if I find out that my child is disabled, that I can abort them, right? How do we start to have those conversations? And we won't be able to have it in a single issue movement. We won't be able to have it here where mostly this is just about disability. They were not talking about race. They were not talking about class largely, not talking about gender on a broad scale. Sometimes white disabled feminists would be able to get their voice in. I think there was like 1 or 2 anthologies, but that's it. How do we have those kind of conversations in a rights-based framework? We can't. So we need a larger framework to be able to hold them.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I think it's
Can you see? Okay.
No, on that slide you were just on, the next one.
This one?
I want to just make sure you're using environmental racism and environmental justice interchangeably, right?
No.
Okay. Because people have a debate about, right now I'm working on a project with someone, and I've been calling environmental racism, and she said it's not environmental racism, it's environmental justice. So I noticed in the earlier slide you're calling environmental justice.
Yeah, they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. Environmental racism, I feel like, would be one thing that environmental justice people are fighting against.
Okay.
The cause for the need for environmental justice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding that.
Okay. No, that's great. That's great. Thank you. Other questions? Clarifying questions? Okay. You're getting everything that I'm saying? It's amazing. I love it. Can I have a time check too? Am I okay? So, I like to tease you. You're like, ooh. Okay. Yes.
Actually, this slide is way over my head.
Okay.
So, can you expand a little bit on how disability gets constructed, for example, in war and militarization and so on?
Yes.
You.
Excellent, excellent. Not excellent that you're not following me, but excellent that you're asking the question. Okay, so when we think about war and militarization, right, we can think about what happens to people's bodies when bombs are falling from the sky or when they get shot, right? We can think about how war and militarization disable people, and then not just people, but entire countries, entire groups of people. So if we think about, like, a great example too, I think, is police brutality, right? If we think about police brutality as a way of constructing disability in certain neighborhoods, and what happens to people who are constantly being harassed or physically beat up on by the police, right? What happens to your body when you don't have access to food or water, for example? What kinds of illnesses happen? What happens to your body, period? Whether it's illness, whether it's, that you have to lose an arm or a leg. So we think about environmental racism, right? Another example would be what happens to people's bodies if they're living by a landfill, right? If they're breathing in air that's directly downwind from a harmful factory that's polluting the air. What happens to people who are living in cycles of violence? And of course, not just physically, also emotionally and mentally. I mean, when I say bodies, I mean that broadly, to include people's minds as well, because I know that has been a sticking point in the disability movement. What happens to bodies, when you're working in dangerous and unsafe work conditions? Actually, dangerous and unsafe work conditions is one of the main places where people get disabled. And who gets disabled in those? Who has to work in dangerous and unsafe working conditions, right? Who are the people that have to take those jobs? And who are the people that can afford the luxury to choose where they're going to work, to choose to work in a safer environment, right? Whether you're a sex worker, whether you're a migrant farm worker, whether you're working in a meat slaughterhouse. Slaughterhouses have a lot of injuries all the time. Whether you are forced to go into the military because maybe that's your only route to get to a scholarship to school. Is that helping to give a little bit more grounding? Okay. Is there other questions? This is great, clarifying questions like that, because I definitely want to bring you all along with me, not be riding out into the sunset by myself. Yes?
So the examples were great. Can you use the last one?
Medical industrial.
A little bit, something that I've not looked at a chart like that.
The medical industrial complex. Great. So maybe we can even go, oh, I can point it to this. Oh, okay. So folks who are in mental health institutions, for example, right? Psychiatric wards in particular are really known for the violence that happens there, are known for the sexual violence that happens. A lot of youth who are living in group homes. I was just in North Carolina last year, and I was at the State School for the Blind, and they used to have segregated state schools for the blind. They had one for the black blind youth, and then they had one for the white blind youth. And we were in the one for the black blind youth. They combined them, and it was actually right next to the prison. So you could like look across the fence and see the prison right there. But some of the people there at my training had gone to that actual school. We're talking about the sexual violence that happened and the beatings that happened in that school. So another example of how if we include those within the medical industrial complex, we can see how those cycles of violence also impact people physically, right? And let me just give one more example. So also when we think about the experimentation that is done regularly and routinely, particularly on people of color and particularly on poor folks within the medical industrial complex, and how, the mishaps that happen in surgery or what have you, and all of those violations, we can also think about how disability gets constructed there. Is that helpful? Okay, you're welcome. Yes?
I was just going to ask, are you equating the medical industrial complex with structural or systematic discrimination? Is that kind of what it is, on a broader?
Yes, yes.
I needed to lump it, kind of a broader.
No, that's great. That's great. I think it's like one of those larger institutions that we have to keep including whenever we talk about things, because people start listing off, they'll say the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, but they won't ever talk about the medical industrial complex. And I think part of that is because it is a really different kind of complex. Folks who are working for abolition, right, the end of prisons, who see it as a legacy of slavery, folks who are working for abolition, there is a very good argument that we could live without prisons. There is no need for it, right? But when we think about the medical industrial complex and how intertwined our lives are in it, and that right now it's one of the only alternatives, right? One of the only options for people to go to when they need help. How do we begin? What would it look like to take down the medical industrial complex or to take it on? What would transformation look like, especially for disabled people whose very livelihood and survival oftentimes is intertwined in here, right? It's very hard to push against something when you're dependent on it to help you to survive. So how do we begin to think about these things as we think about our organizing in whatever work that you all are doing, and how the medical industrial complex is a huge player, and not just for people with disabilities, right? We can think about the ways in which queer folks and trans folks and women in particular historically were always sent to mental health institutions. That these used to be the prisons, these used to be the jails. This is where the criminals, the folks who with actual disabilities and the people who had no disabilities but who were just coded as being wrong were sent. Right? So if we can look at all of these in most of our movements, I think, that we're working in, and where it bumps up against the medical industrial complex and where it doesn't. Yeah.
When I'm looking at this chart, I'm curious if you see where this big debate right now here in the state, and I'm sure across the United States, on legalized medical marijuana plays in with the disability justice. And I only ask that because I didn't know if you see that potentially becoming, as I look at pharmaceutical and distributors, where if you see that ever becoming a part of the problem. Because I just, on Monday, interviewed a lady who actually is disabled, and she's got one of the state cards where she can grow marijuana and stuff like that. And she got that because she was disabled. So I don't know if you ever see where that will have any bearing on this whole industrial complex.
That is a large question. I don't know that I can answer all of it right now, but maybe afterwards we could talk about it. But no, but it's a great question though. Yeah, most definitely. Yes?
So I don't know how to ask this question, but I'm wondering if assumed in this are those entities that fund those different boxes.
Yes.
So in terms of multinational corporations, but also individual donors and funding sources. Is that just assumed within that side?
I mean, that could be an extension of it, most definitely. It could especially live under here, right? When we think about who funds these nonprofit charity organizations, as well as, I mean, you know, then we get into the whole like religious like industry, right, of money making and profit, which is could be a whole nother slide as well. Yes, most definitely. This is great, yeah. We should add insurance companies. Every time we show this, people like say things, and we're like, why didn't we think about that? No, yes, no, that's great.
You look at how insurance companies operate in terms of who they allow companies for.
Yes, right, and that is totally like a very clear site of where disability gets constructed, where you are actually told you're disabled or you're not, right? And what the criteria is, the arbitrary criteria for disability. Excellent. And again, based and grounded in the medical industrial complex and the medical model. Oh, I love when we make connections like this. Any other clarifying questions? Excellent. Or comments? Yeah.
Well, the term medical industrial complex sounds kind of spooky, creepy, bad. And I understand what you're saying, but there's a lot of good that's being done too, and you know, in hospitals and nonprofit charities and so on. So I think that complicates the issue. I mean, it's not all totally bad.
Yes, and I think that here we're talking about specifically nonprofit charity organizations, not all of them, but who have been grounded and made their living off of, you know, disability-specific things, right? Like Stop Curing Autism or whatever it might be that folks are doing. And I think that is exactly what I think is so important about what you're saying is what we were just talking about, right? That it's a very complex system. It's not like something where you can look at it and be like, everything about that is bad. Like there are some things, you know, if I was fatally wounded by a bullet tomorrow, I would go to the hospital. You know, I wouldn't be like, I'm not going to go to the medical industrial complex, right? Like, I mean, maybe some people would though. I mean, and that's a very real thing too. I know a lot of people, because of their trauma, and my trauma in particular, has been very horrible. But I think though what it's pointing to is what is the system for what sake, right? What is the purpose of this system? And that I would say, and I think from a disability justice perspective, would say that it's about profit, not about people's actual welfare. And even though it might have started in that place, like even though there might be good doctors or there might be some people that are actually doing good work, when we look at it as a system, as a larger overarching system, that it is about, you know, the hungry, kind of thick, vast vines of the medical industrial complex is about making a profit. And also more insidious, more spooky, like what you're talking about, is that there also seems to be something else going on that's even deeper than profit, that seems to be about which groups are getting targeted and how bodies are getting, the notion of healthy bodies gets constructed, and how that harms our communities. And that this is one of the main sites where that's happening. And then it plays across our communities in all different kind of ways. You know, I know for myself, my own experience with the medical industrial complex, I couldn't tell where the politics of medicine, you know, were separated from the politics of beauty and the politics of just, I would even just say congeniality, you know, like, where did those start and stop, and where did they begin? When I was getting my brace, I had lots and lots of braces when I was younger. You know, it was the doctor's reasoning for it was always about like, it'll make you look like you're, you know, nobody will tell you have a disability. And I can't really see how that's about my well-being and not about profit or just about being, you know, getting work, or about the more kind of deeper pieces, the underbelly of ableism, about constructing healthy bodies and targeting certain people, right? So I think it's really important, though, to keep bringing that up, because when we think about what it would take to go up against the medical industrial complex, and when we think about what it would take to start incorporating this into our work, all of our work, these are the kind of questions, exactly what you're asking, that we have to also keep in mind. Are you just looking at me? You didn't have something to say? Okay. Hi. But great though, yes. It's like a comedy routine up here, politics and a little bit of sideshow. Do you want, is there any other clarifying questions? Are there? Yeah.
I just kind of want to expand on what you said. Like I have, Spectrum Health. I go to Spectrum Health and stuff, and mental health, things like that. And those to your doctor's appointment and you can get Botox all in the same visit. So, that's like when you said that the medical and physical things are getting mixed up, I see that the most when I'm in the waiting room staring at the end of Botox.
Right, right. And again, it's not just disabled bodies, right? That we can keep expanding this. We can look at how communities of color have been targeted, and even how communities of color's bodies have been coded as being disabled, right? As being that people of color have always been thought of as being less smart or less intelligent, or that, you know, our bodies have special abilities. So, oh, your fingers are so nimble, they're made for sweatshops, or, you know, that you're made, but you know, this is real. Certain people's bodies are just made to pick cotton, or just made to work out in the field. You know, that all of these, I don't know why I'm picking up this, that all of these things have been part of our history. Excellent. Okay, so we're going to keep moving. Can I have another time check? Because I don't know how long that just took. So questions about this? People understanding this? Getting it? Sinking in? 50 minutes. Great. Okay. Any more examples on this that people need? All right, great. So I think I'm just offering this quickly because there's a whole like exercise and things that we can't go through it all right now. But to offer this is loosely what we're beginning to think of as the 3 pillars of disability justice, just to offer to you all as a place, I think, as a very useful place to begin to connect our work across movements, right? Or whatever work that you might be in, that you might be doing. That one piece would be policing people's bodies, policing bodies in general. The other piece would be the myth of independence, so the idea, right, that everybody can and should be able to do everything on their own, and that there are people who actually do, which we know is a myth, because even the clothes that we're all wearing right now were probably made by somebody we don't even know. That to be dependent is, you're considered a burden, right? It's considered a weakness. It's something that you don't want to be. And we can see how this plays out in lots and lots of different types of movements, right? And as well, even extending to families, that families should be these independent little spheres that operate on their own. And if you have to take help from the state, then you're not doing as well. If you can't provide financially for your family and have to ask for help from somebody, then you're not seen as fit, right, or as desirable. And then the MIC, of course, the medical industrial complex, and this notion of health. And I would say that these 3 pillars of disability justice, actually, we could take this and cut through any other movement that we're talking about, and look at how it is harming us. In particular, the myth of independence and its connections to capitalism, its connections to a work culture, right? The idea that disability, that ableism and capitalism are so intertwined, sometimes it's hard to tell where one starts and the other one stops. When you think about how disabled people, and even disability in and of itself, has been framed as it's because you can't work. It's because you're not valuable anymore because your body can't produce capital, right? Can't produce wages, can't make money, can't be exploited by somebody else to make money. So I would offer these 3 things as places, particularly policing of bodies. I think that that's a great kind of meeting point and entry point for whatever work that we're doing. Yes, for whatever work that we're doing. Making sense to folks? Yeah? Helpful? Okay. So disability justice. So what are we talking about actually when we say disability justice? This is a visual that I've been using. Usually it's on paper, so it's really nice to see it on the big screen. Hello. So first and foremost is, oh, look at how strange that came out with the Y down there. So first and foremost would be, what would be placing disability in the center? And I think that's a huge shift for our movements and our social justice movements, even to begin there. That disability isn't window dressing, it's not something that's secondary. What would it mean to center disability and to start from that place, right? When we think about disability justice. This next box is access, and I'm gonna get to that in a second. And out here I have different systems of oppression, different institutions, or different institutions that are happening. And what we would do, what we are going to do, is usually we stop at this box, this orange box that says access, right? And I'm going to use prisons as an example. So what we might, if we center disability and begin to connect disability in prisons, for example, what might live in this access box are things like accessible prisons, right? things like incarcerated people need to have access to their medication, right? They need to be able to get to their meds. But what might live out here, and the conversation that we never get to because we're always so focused on access, and that is largely because of the severity of ableism, might be how does ableism help prisons and the prison industrial complex, and a larger question of whether or not prisons should even exist, right? And where the history of prisons intertwined with the history of mental health institutions, right? Like I talked about before, that they used to be the jails. But we don't get out here usually. We're stuck here, right? We're stuck in this box right here, if we look at sexism in women, talking about access to clinics. Do they have a wheelchair ramp or what have you? We don't get to a larger discussion about ableism and why disability is a feminist issue, because most of the time it's women who are doing the care of disabled people, of disabled children, right? A lot of times it's women of color who are doing that work. We don't get out here because we're so focused here because this barely even exists, access. So what we would say in disability justice is we want to move beyond access. And we don't want to lose access, but we want to move beyond just access. We want to move to justice. The liberation of disabled people can't be boiled down to logistics and should not be boiled down to logistics. That we actually have to start thinking about what access means in context, in a political context, right? When we start thinking about a culture of ableism, how do we shift that? We all know that just because disabled people are in the room doesn't mean that there's no ableism, right? Just because we have women here doesn't mean there's no sexism happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because there's people of color doesn't mean that there's no racism. So how do we start to get to the deeper conversations, the larger conversations, and the more systematic conversations that we would call disability justice work? And that access, if we do it, and we have to do access, because access, there's no way around access. Access is tangible resistance to an able-bodied culture, able-bodied supremacist culture. So we have to do access, and we're not saying that access is not important. What we're saying, though, is that access should be done in ways that move us closer to justice. It should not just stop there. And the way that it's done, we should think about the way that access is done, so it's done in a political context. Is that making sense to folks, right? So when we think about, it's not to just have a ramp, that we want to think about what a deeper kind of access could look like, that is grounded in relationship building, that's grounded in people being able to feel comfortable enough to even ask for what they need. Sense? Good? Clarifying questions about this, because we're about to use it. Okay, so what we're going to do, and I'll tell you what we're going to do, and then maybe all questions. Like we have lots of questions to stall us. So what we're going to do is break off into groups. Well, actually, I'll have you all sit at your tables and talk about it. And you're going to take one section and talk about what you would fill out, what lives here in the access box, and what lives here. So here might be accessible churches, right? For example, or accessible religious institutions, right? Here might be larger undergirding things around religion, like particularly Christianity jumps to my mind. Like you'll recognize sinners by their limp, right? The ways in which religion has been used to guide us morally, with moral and religious beliefs around disability and how we think about bodies, how we think about sexuality, right? So I think that this is a beginning. Obviously, it's not the end-all, be-all. And obviously, these are not mutually exclusive, and they're very, very connected to each other. But that it's a beginning starting place to start to think of how do we move beyond just access, and how do we put in here things that are access in a political context. What are the connections between disability and capitalism and class? What are the connections between disability and queerness and sexuality and education and prisons and white supremacy and war and militarization, some of which we've already talked about, right? Does anybody need like maybe one or two examples of any? Would you like to tell me which ones you want? I could just pick them out. Great. So this could be like access to queer sexuality that includes for disabled queer youth, right? that never happens. And up here could be even deeper things, like I would say one of the reasons why queer people I think are thought of as less than is because the criteria to be able-bodied also includes the ability to reproduce, and we're not thought of as being able to do that, right, on our own. And so when we think about the myth of getting back to the myth of independency again, right, and that's bad, that you need help and everything, when we think about how desire and sexuality is even thought of, and who has access to desire and sexuality and access to queer community. I mean, that might live here too, access to queer community, access to, I was just talking about that today in my talk, right? That a lot of queer community, particularly queer people of color community, happens underground. It happens not in public space. And a lot of those places are not accessible. They're people's houses, right? They have stairs, the bathrooms are inaccessible. If we think about folks who use wheelchairs, if we think about people with environmental illnesses, they don't have, they're not scent free, they're not chemical free, and so people can't be part of it. That's great. Any other ones? Feel okay? So we have a lot of tables, and I'm going to just kind of go tick it off around. So hopefully you'll get the one that you like. And maybe the two of you all might want to join one of these tables. Okay, so table 15, can we have somebody who's going to help remember? If we could just start here, sexism in women, and table 13 could have religion. What is your number in the back? 9 could have war and militarization. You all could have white supremacy and race. You could have prisons and the prison industrial complex. Right there, you could have education. Here, yes, number 1 could have, where am I? Sexuality and queerness. Did I do education? Yeah, number 10 could be capitalism and class. Lisa, what is your table? 3. Sexism in women. Religion could be number 4. War and militarization, right back there. I'm going to go all the way in the back to do white supremacy and race. I'm going to do it. Table 11 will be prisons and the prison industrial complex again. Table 14 will be education. Queer sexuality will be table 16, and you all will have capitalism and class. It's so perfect. I didn't even do that on purpose. So we're going to have about like 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If you could have a note taker just to take notes, fill out the access box and the larger beyond access box. And people may want to use the bathroom during this time. Conversations. We're going to keep on trucking through. I know it's a lot. I hope you had great conversations. How were, maybe a show of hands, folks that had good, interesting conversations at their table? Shows of hands. Okay, great. We'll just leave it at that. No. Okay, no. So maybe if we could actually hear, if I leave this, can you all hear me? Yeah. Maybe, so if we could actually hear maybe like 3 access, 3 things. If groups that want to, or somebody who wants to share from their group, an access piece and then a beyond access piece from one of the boxes. I see one hand out. Just if you could share one thing, and then we'll have 2 other people. I know, just pick one thing that you like.
We don't know if we're right, but one of the things that we said, well, can I say 2 things?
You can say one thing. Well, wait. But just to be mindful, wait 1 second. So you're gonna do. When I say one thing, I mean say one thing like one. You're gonna say an access thing and a beyond access thing for one of the segments. Does that make sense?
No, I'll just say what I was gonna.
Okay, say what you're gonna say.
So one of the things that we said, this is pretty. This kind of was a thought at the end, but just in terms of like our environment around the issue of race and race is during like an event like Katrina. And a population of Americans who were probably, didn't have access to, maybe medicines that they needed. There's higher rates of diabetes and different kinds of chronic illnesses in these communities of color. And just how, kind of in one instance, they're really impacted and kind of put into this arena and didn't have what they probably needed for maybe some disabilities that they were addressing. And then secondly, on top of that, so this goes along with it, is
then when people were put into trailers, like the formaldehyde from the trailers, and so some of those issues that coming out of this natural disaster. So I don't know if are we on target?
That's great. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
we want to know if you're right.
Those are great examples for the box.
And disability, great. Yes. So other groups who want to share maybe two more things. So one other person right here, and then we'll come here. Perfect.
In terms of access, one of the things we talk about in education specifically is it's a lot easier to notice and make accommodations for people in many cases with physical disabilities, but a lot of times there are hidden disabilities, whether it be learning or chronic
Yes.
condition. And in order to which kind of goes into the beyond piece, which is in order to assess that, the assessments are based on the whole idea of the normal, the what's right, and they vary. A lot of times they'll disadvantage people by race. They'll disadvantage people by socioeconomic status, when in reality what it comes back to is the whole idea of people in certain areas aren't going to receive the quality of education that other people are going to, so they're going to be learning disabled, but they just didn't have the same starting point.
Great. Excellent. Yes. Great. Right here.
We talk about access to religion. And so you can have churches that will be barrier-free, but when you get inside, they may not be able to access the religion community because there are sermons that are being said that are oppressive, or there are being statements that are being made about healing, and if you have faith, you must be healed.
Yes. Yes. That's so good. Yes. Thank you, everybody. I wish we had time to hear all of you all's things. I would love to, but we don't. So, but thank you. Those were really, all of them were great examples and great places. When a great tool, I feel like this is this visual is a great tool to start to begin to connect how disability connects to all of any community that you're a part of. There are disabled people. It doesn't matter what community you're talking about that you're working with. There are disabled people, whether you know it or not, whether they know it or not. Okay. So we're going to go from here to this. This is where we're going to end, to beyond access, and start to get a feel of, now that we have a bit more of a lens, right, a bit more of an analysis to think about, of how to think about disability on a broad level, what does it look like when we actually kind of lay it down on the ground? How does it roll? It's a beautiful floating social justice jewel, but does it actually like move and function? So again, disabled people's liberation can't be boiled down to logistics. Again, access must be done in a political context and framework, always, whenever we're doing it. And I think this is something Lisa said, and I love it, is that it sets the blueprint for organizing, right? That we're centering the most complex bodies so that everybody can be included. And that has to be where I think is the best place for us to start, so that we can truly be doing social justice work. We can truly be working for liberation. One of the things I think that is so helpful, and I'm going to give an example, is that disability grounds us in relationships and bodies automatically. Because we all know, and I know this is my lived experience as a disabled person, that access is done through relationships. Oftentimes the people who are providing access for you, because most people don't have assistance or can't afford to pay for PAs, whether or not they get approved by the state. But most people's access is done through relationships, whether it's their family members, whether it's whatever type of relationship they have with their caretaker, even if they're given a state PA, what that relationship looks like oftentimes depends on how that access is going to be, the quality of that access. And so automatically we're grounded in how do we build relationships in our organizing. That's beyond just getting numbers, but that's actually starting to think about people. The other piece I want to pull out here is the intimacy of access, right? That I think about it sometimes as the internal work versus the external work. And I think I think about it as being very connected to patriarchy, right? What gets seen as like the work is like protest or policy work, and the internal work doesn't often get as visible. It doesn't. Mostly, it's not visible, and it doesn't get as valued, right? When we think about not just things like how are you feeling, not just what you think, but also things about disability, because it's so intimate. It's so done largely in the private sphere, right? And that is a lot to do with because a lot of disabled people cannot work. And so and because the world is not accessible. So a lot of our stuff happens, our lives happen at home or behind closed hospital doors, in group homes where there are no cameras, or there is no accountability, and oftentimes it's women's work. And we know how women's work gets coded when we think about our movements. So I'm going to give an example, and that is going to speak directly to all of these points, to how do we deepen access and begin to think about interdependence, and using interdependence as a framework and as a politic that we can actually move with, that's beyond whether or not we're doing work specifically around disability, but hopefully all of our work includes an analysis on disability justice. So I did some organizing this summer with folks. There was, I don't know if y'all heard of it, the United States Social Forum happened in Detroit. And right before that happened in Detroit, there was a conference called the Allied Media Conference. And there was a bunch of us who wanted to go. It was the Allied Media Conference, the AMC. They had the first ever disability justice track that was being offered this summer. And so it was a very exciting time. We all wanted to go and be part of it. And then we thought, we don't know what access is going to look like. And because movement spaces, just like all spaces pretty much, are so inaccessible, we thought, how are we going to possibly be okay and be able to provide access for ourselves? We had most of us didn't really have access to any kind of money or resources, very limited budgets to be able to fly there and fly PAs, personal attendants, who could help people, and think about folks who couldn't afford to have PAs. What is our access going to look like? And then we realized that it was about 5 of us, beyond us 5, that there were probably going to be lots and lots of other disabled people going. What does that look like? Who's going to be looking out for their access, our access, outside of conference spaces, right? Because we want to start thinking beyond just the meeting room, beyond just the protest, beyond just the workshop. For us, we were thinking about how are we going to get to food? I mean, if some of us can't walk very far, how are we going to be able to get food if your wheelchair can't get in the restaurant door? If some people can't use phones, if some people can't, we had a lot of folks with us who couldn't read, some folks who couldn't read in particular numbers, people who had assistance dogs who oftentimes aren't allowed into restaurants or into any places getting food. And we knew that the only situation they had at the conference was dorm style living, so we knew that we weren't going to have access to like a kitchen or anything like that. And it started us thinking around, what does disability justice actually look like on the ground? How do we move together? And that became kind of like what we kept saying was we move together. But it was incredibly difficult. We had to strategize for like 20, 40 minutes to even figure out how to get from one end of the block to the other end of the block, because some people needed to use disability vans. We had folks who were visually impaired and blind who needed audio describers to describe, what was going on or what was happening outside to them, and folks to help guide them. We had folks who had assistance dogs who couldn't read, who needed people to be able to read menus or get texts for them, who wouldn't be able to. A lot of our communication was through text, who wouldn't be able to have access to that. We had folks who had chemical sensitivity. We had folks who had chronic fatigue, right? People who had to step out a lot. People who had seizures sometimes, who needed to be able to leave the room. We had folks like myself who had physical mobility impairments, who couldn't walk long distances. But we had also had folks who were in power wheelchairs who could zoom down the block and go for blocks on end, but couldn't necessarily reach to be able to get their food from the counter to the tabletop. We had all different types of folks. It was intergenerational. We had people who were in their 50s and 40s. We had folks who were just starting out. We had parents who brought their kids, disabled parents who brought their kids. We had people who had been identifying as politically disabled for years and years and years, and we had people who were just starting to come out as politically disabled, who had been disabled their whole lives, but who had never really started to think about what it meant to be disabled. And most of us, all of us were queer, majority women of color, majority, there was a significant amount of trans folks and genderqueer folks, majority young people, and it was just kind of one of those moments where we really had to sit and think, what does this look like on the ground, and how do we do this? And one of those structures that we came up with, since I know we're going to get into like concrete things, is a structure of pods. And we thought, well, everybody who's coming is going to probably have some kind of access set up already. They're going to have some kind of people that they're comfortable with for their access needs, because we knew we couldn't provide for everybody's access needs or their medical needs, because it's just not feasibly possible, and we didn't have the relationships to do that, because a lot of it is very intimate work. And so, I mean, hopefully you all know that as well. I mean, it's impossible to do that. So what we came up with was this idea of pods, that people would be in their pods, and their pods would be made up of them and the folks who were closest to them that were coming to help them with their access. And what we would do was connect those pods together. It was important to us and integral to have all of our meals together, so we made sure that everybody had food access. We had folks who didn't have, some people had more money than other people, so we had people who were offering up. We were defining access broadly, so we have people who are offering up, I have a credit card that I can put, so I can put money down if you don't have any cash. I have cash that I can bring to help give cash to people who may not have access to immediate cash right now. We had folks who were like, I'm better at coordinating things. I'm really good on the phone. I can order. I'm comfortable talking to other people. We had people who were like, I have social anxiety. I'm much better calming people down one-on-one. If you need somebody to sit with you while you're having a seizure, I can do that. We had folks who were strategizing with genderqueer and trans people and disabled people together around how to use the bathroom, how to get access to the bathroom and be safe in using the bathroom. So it was a really beautiful experience, and I think one of the only times that I've really witnessed collective access happening. And we called it that. We called it creating collective access. And we made sure that we also slept, the places where we slept were near to each other. We had one room that was all scent-free for people who needed fragrance and chemicals and scent-free places to be. And then we had another room that was two other rooms that were all disabled people. We got all of each other's cell phone numbers. We put out a call, we put out a call on the internet, so it was all people that we didn't even know. We had never met them before. And so we made sure we ate together, we had everybody's cell phone numbers, and it really was collective. Everybody pitched in and took on different nights to organize and coordinate food. We never had to worry about it. You would just meet in the meeting place where we said at whatever time was the lunch time, and food would just like appear. I was like, this is amazing. I can't even believe this. But truly, like disabled people working together for each other, centering access as not something that was shameful, but something that actually opened up an opportunity for us to build deeper relationships with each other. Because if we didn't have that need of access, we probably wouldn't have even gotten to know each other. But that we saw it as a strength, as an opportunity to build on need, and that need was something that we were appreciative of and embracing, and that we were making space too for cross-disability work to happen, because a lot of disabled communities are very segregated. Like all the blind folks are in one place, all the folks in power chairs are in another place, all the people with psych needs are kind of kept away. So it was really beautiful also to figure out how that all worked. And amazing for myself, I think, to be able to offer access help to folks as somebody who's usually always needs access from other people. And we also had able-bodied folks with us. And I think that's one of the things that really separates from disability from a lot of other movements, is that we need able-bodied people, that we are automatically interdependent, because it's never going to be that we can have a disability-only space. It's much different than POC work, right? Like we have people of color space all the time, where it's like, this is just for people of color. But with disability spaces, we just can't have that, because some people aren't able to be there like that. And so how do we then begin to shift our thinking so that we're building interdependently, and that we're building simultaneously around privilege and oppression at the same time? And that, I think, is really complicated work. So I say all of this, so all of these are up here because I think that when we think about what it means to move beyond access, to begin to shift a culture, right? That we were creating a culture together that embraced need, a culture that embraced collectivity, a culture that embraced people asking for help, a culture that really, at the crux of it, I think, was anti-ableist and anti-capitalist, right? That we were figuring out how to redistribute all resources to all of us, and a culture that embraced difference. So that because we knew that we were not all the same and that was okay. What do we do? Some of the complex questions that I have as I've been doing more cross-disability work and multi-ability work with non-disabled folks as well, is how do we hold the reality that some people can do less? That's all. Some people's bodies and limitations will mean that they have to do less, and hold that as just as valuable as people who do more. What does that look like as we live in a capitalist society where we're kind of taught that we should all pull our own weight? But even in collective work, when we were at the Pod People in Detroit, I mean, there were people who could not do as much. And we all had to kind of sit with that. And I think there were some moments where people were like, wait a second, you haven't done anything. But because we had this culture and because we had enough of a gravitational pull, enough people holding those values, political values, front and center so that it didn't start to drift away, it was really helpful to be able to ground us in that and keep coming back to, okay, this is the reality that we want. How do we make that happen? So I think, are we at time? Okay. So I'm going to stop there, and I don't know if there's any clarifying questions before we get into the second half, which I know Lisa's going to lead you all through, around like how to make this work. Yeah? Great, that's a great question. So hold on one second. So these are words that I've made up. No, really, these are words that I've made up that help me. So what in my work, especially, and this is especially true for people of color communities, in my work as I've been moving through the world, I've been meeting a lot of disabled people of color in particular, who don't identify as disabled, who are like, I'm not disabled. And I'd be like, in my head, I'm like, you're sitting in a wheelchair in front of me. Okay, you're not disabled. So what I've come up with, though, is that there is a difference between descriptively disabled and politically disabled, and that a lot of people who are descriptively disabled, meaning they have the lived experience of disability, right? There's somebody who is disabled, whether or not they identify that way. They use a wheelchair, a walker, they've come in contact in lots of ways and been read as disabled in the medical industrial complex. But they're not necessarily politically disabled. They don't necessarily have an analysis on ableism, right? They don't necessarily see themselves as connected to other disabled people, right? When we think about this, right? That this, they're still in the individual piece, right? Like, I'm just a person who happens to have a disability, if I call that, if that at all. Not moving to a collective identity, right? And in particular, I think for like a lot of folks who are already marginalized, so this in particular folks of color, but queer folks as well, queer women of color, I see this happening all the time. I think the risks are also really high to identify as disabled because you're already so stigmatized that to then begin to identify as disabled means not only do you have to confront people in your life around white supremacy or homophobia, but now you're also having to confront people maybe around ableism. And for folks who have, because we know that access is done through relationships, it can be very scary, and it is dangerous, to risk upsetting the balance of those relationships, to start talking about ableism and about power and privilege and how they play out, even amongst, and we had this conversation this afternoon, even amongst disabled children and their parents and their families, people who have been around them their whole lives. As they come out as adults and become disabled, and come out as being disabled, having conversations with their family members about it, about the things that have happened, have gone on. Does that help between the distinction? Yeah? Yeah?
I'm thinking about this when you were talking earlier. Is this sometimes a distinction made between people who have had their disability for their entire life and somebody who maybe took, I was kind of car accident and I ended up, in a wheelchair. I mean, I don't know anything about the topic today, so I feel like I've learned a lot, but I just wonder, do you see a lot of people who are not identifying in that regard?
actually has as much to do with it, because I see it both ways when that happens. I see some people who have become disabled later in life who are just as adamantly being like, I am not disabled. I am not disabled, you know? And I also see a lot of people who have been disabled as children because that's all that they've ever known, not identifying as disabled. So I don't know that that has any real pull on it. Yeah?
How has ADA legislation impacted movement? Another question is, which side of that social model does it fall on? The medical side or the social side or the middle, or is off the charts completely?
I think it falls mostly on the social model, just because it was about changing the social conditions. It was about changing the world, so to speak, you know, and less about changing actual people's bodies, you know, like the eugenics movement, for example. But so I think it falls more under the social model, and I think it's hugely changed. I mean, you know, you think about what things, all of the things that the ADA has done, and of course it's not perfect. The ADA is not perfect by any means, and it has problems with how it's enforced, and all of the, we could get into conversations around policy and all of that. And at the same time, and we wouldn't have accessible parking spots the way that we have them today. Transportation would not be accessible the way that it was today had it not been for the ADA. There wouldn't be as many ramps, you know, and I know, again, access is not perfect and things are not accessible, but in general. And though, I think it has done a tremendous amount of help. It has helped a lot of folks. I mean, there is, you know, there are arguments now on that we have to kind of move away from that and think about some other things. I know that it's like the ADA never dies. I feel like people are just like, the ADA, and I'm like, okay, well, there's other things that need to happen. And though it was a tremendous, huge win, you know, Justin Dart, I know, was one of like the icons of that movement. Another white man, his family like owned Tupperware, and he was disabled. He was sent to Japan to like to open up the Tupperware Japan market or something. Met a Japanese woman and like fell in love. But he was one of the people, and I remember he called it the hidden army. They started sending letters from all over the country to make past the ADA, and he called it the hidden army because, you know, who would ever think that disabled people could be a force to be reckoned with? But I think it was like over 50,000 letters or something got sent. So, yeah, I think it has a huge impact. Yes?
I started hearing the term disability as opposed to disability.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that?
Diff-ability?
Yeah.
There's so many different terms, and you're saying that is different from differently abled?
Yeah.
Diff-ability.
Diff-ability.
I mean, there's so many terms, and I had this question earlier today. So first and foremost, I think people should be able to name themselves however they choose to name themselves, especially folks who have been historically named by other people. So whatever people, disabled people, whatever any disabled people, however they decide to call themselves, I am good with that, and I support them in whatever they need. And I mean, there's so many different names. So it gets hard. I know I use disabled because that's what feels good to me, and it feels like a political term. I don't like the term differently abled. I never really have, but I can see the good intentions behind it. I know less about the term diff-abled, and I don't know if that's maybe a geographical thing. That, you know, I was living in Atlanta for 12 years, and now I've just gotten to Berkeley. So if I've maybe missed it in the move, I was in like, you know, I traveled cross country in a truck, so I felt like I kind of lost touch with the world. But I haven't heard it. I'm excited about it, though. I wonder, too, who's using it and who's not. You know, I know there's a lot of controversy around CRIP along like race lines, and then there's also folks who feel like that's a really powerful political term. So, yeah.
What's that you just mentioned?
CRIP is a word that a lot of disabled people use. It's insider language that a lot of disabled people use as a reclamation of the word cripple. And so people call themselves Crips or Crips. And there's been some, there's pushback around the implications around race in particular, like the Bloods and the Crips and like gang culture. And because the disability movement has historically been so white, what that means to use that word. And also there's a lot of folks who just, you know, don't like reclaiming words at all, who are just like, we need to be called people with disabilities and person first language and all of that. But CRIP definitely is an insider word, so it's like what disabled people call each other. It's not to be used from able-bodied folks. Yeah. Yeah. Tell me whenever the time is done, by the way.
I just had a question. So I grew up immigrant population, and a lot of people there are undocumented, and that leads to a lot of exploitation, especially in the workplace, and a lot of them that do have disabilities, I mean, they pay taxes, but they don't have access to health care, and there's all these complications. And when you're undocumented, it doesn't matter if you're white or colored. And
Right.
I guess in this sense, you don't have access to the kinds of health care that you need. And so I guess I just have a question of, because you haven't spoken to the idea of individuals that are undocumented, and I was wondering like where your work aligns, or like some thoughts around the fact that people that can be disabled can also not have any proper documentation. And keep in mind, I'm not using the word illegal immigrants because that's very xenophobic and very stigmatizing to a group of people who are humans. But I guess in this sense, where does privilege lie? Does it lie on color? And I guess my question is, where does your work align in terms of people that are disabled but are also undocumented?
That's really great. So I think the piece around, particularly people of color and immigrants, like that's a really complicated, there's lots of things happening there, and a lot of it too is around not just culture, but around like specifically what you look like skin color and like facial features and all of that. Where I stand around folks that are undocumented and disabled is exactly one part of a huge piece of the medical industrial complex to me is that it has been co-opted by the state, right? And a lot of it is state. You have to have ID, right? You have to be documented in order to get those services. And so immigrants definitely would be part of the disability justice movement and this, part of the larger group of people who don't have access to a lot of the things that we're even talking about that have been like touted as, this is progress, quote unquote, for people with disabilities, because it's like, for who? For which people with disabilities? And I think one of the pieces around undocumented folks and disabilities is that this is exactly why we need to think about what a different kind of healthcare or well-being or holistic care, however we want to look at it, needs to be a different way for folks to get the kind of care that they need, because there's like such a rub, right, between people who are fighting to receive care and people who are fighting to refuse the right to refuse care. And that we can fight for both of them and hopefully be in solidarity with each other, so that it's not like the folks who have access to care are like, actually screw that, that's horrible, when there's like people who don't even have access to that, who are like, actually I would like to be able to go to the dentist or whatever it is. But that we can build alliances on that so we can see all sides of the medical industrial complex, for example, and the good pieces, right? The pieces that actually help some of us survive and get through, and we can see the harm that it's doing, so that as we're fighting for the right to receive care, we can also fight for the right to receive just care, and also be thinking about alternatives, because not everybody who receives care or who, when you receive care, is going to like the care you get, it's not going to necessarily be good care. So how do we think about all of those things together? I know it's like a large answer to your question, but I mean, that's the thing, those are the things that I think about every day. What would Kindred, a Southern Healing Justice Collective that's being formed in the South, the folks who are forming that and I have conversations all the time. What would it look like to not only have holistic practitioners and healers be trained in disability justice so that they're not perpetuating ableism through their work and through their healing work, and what would it look like to hook up those folks with disabled folks who don't have access to the very kind of systems that we're talking about and the medical care that we're talking about, so that people could have access to care as an alternative to the system we're talking about. So I think, are we at time? Yes, okay. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Oh, amazing.
No, it's okay, love. I'm all good.
You don't need it?
Wow, thanks, Mia. That was really amazing. And I want to say that, we intentionally planned this session section to be last, not because it is the least important. It is because this moment, this conversation with Mia about disability justice, about access, is really critical to all of the other sessions that came before it. And in a sense, really what we're saying with this is intersectionality does not exist without access and universal design. So this is really how we have built up to this moment in this conversation. All the other frameworks, all the other conversations that we have had really build up to this critically important piece. So we hope that it is something that you take with you, and that it is a constant reminder that you're not doing, and none of us are doing, intersectional work if it's not accessible, and if we're not talking about universal design, and also if we're not going beyond just the question of access, as Mia has talked to us about tonight. So thank you again, a really wonderful conversation. And we're going to be building from here. We have an hour left, and we want to take this hour to reflect, to synthesize, and to really begin to plan for our next steps, our next roles here in the work. And I want to bring us back to a place where we started at the beginning with a really, I think, important quote by Gandhi. Every step and role in liberation must have liberation in it. And not only did we talk about that in the first session, but Suzanne and Paulina also reminded us of this important quote in the second session. And it has been a running theme. And we hope that through your ongoing organizing, community organizing work, that you hold tightly to this quote. When we organize without staying rooted in our commitment to our mutual liberation, individual and collective bodies get thrown under the bus. We hope that Change U has provided all of you, as it has for us, with some additional tools in your organizer tool belt for fostering more inclusive, accountable, and accessible communities for everyone. So that has been our hope, that has been our intention from the beginning. And we hope, like I said, that you hold tightly to that quote. In our closing hour together, we're going to take this opportunity to reflect and synthesize, as I said, and we're going to spend some time with each other really looking at the body of work, the body of conversation that we've had over 5 months now, over 5 sessions. And we'll close Change U together doing that. As Colette mentioned at the beginning of our time, we're going to be working on our next evolution of Change U. We're hoping that we'll be able to do not only a repeat of this, but also have a 2.0, some sort of advanced organizer training moving forward. And your feedback is going to be critical to that process, as we hope you have been able to see, because we've taken it really seriously, every evaluation that each one of you has submitted, we have read, we've taken seriously, and we have incorporated into how we have evolved these 5 sessions. And tonight's evaluation and tabletop conversation over the last hour will do the same. We will take each and everything seriously, and we will look at your feedback and begin to start crafting the next evolution of Change U. So together, we're going to begin to start looking at some questions here. And what we'd like to do is take about 15 or 20 minutes and look at 3 questions. We're hoping that at each table you can select a scribe, somebody who will take some notes, because what we want to do is collect those notes at the end. So you're going to pass in an evaluation, individual evaluation in relationship to Mia's session. And we're going to be looking at those very seriously. And then we're going to ask you to take some notes about your conversation and make sure that those get passed in as well, because we're going to be looking at those too. Let me just get those questions up right here so we have them on the screen. I'm not escaping here. Hold on one second. Yes, that's a lot. Okay. Just here, one after the other, one step. So, We have evaluation, Carrie's passing around paper, great, thank you. So make sure that you have your scribe in a few minutes, and I'm going to go through the questions. And then what we'll do is we will take time to take one at a time, have some conversation, and come back together. So the first question is, having been exposed to social justice movements, economic justice, disability justice, racial justice, reproductive justice, etc., through the course of Change You, within a relational organizing model, how can they be applied to the work you are doing or hope to do? All right, so that's the first question. I think I'm actually going to stop there, and then we'll have some conversation, give you one question at a time, and then in about 15 minutes we'll come back, have a little conversation, and then we'll go to the next question. All right, any clarifying questions about this question? I know that sounds a little too many questions. Nope, clear to everybody? Okay, and does every table have a scribe? Yes. Great. And if you could please put, folks, if you could please put the number of your table at the top of the page, that would be very helpful. The number of your table at the top of the page that you're going to be passing in to us, that would be great. More time together, I promise. Welcome back. Welcome back. All right. Excellent. All right, so what I want to do is just hear from one or two tables what it is that you came up with, and then we're going to move quickly to the next question. So I am actually going to choose two tables because I want to just hear quickly. Why don't I take this one in the very back? Which number is that? Because you probably all, 9. Okay, one thing that you all came up with.
One thing was that for some of the organizations that some of us are part of is to have trainings for the work we do around issues that maybe we haven't been thinking about or that we need improvement on or work on, is to get, to do more intersectional sort of training to improve our capacity as a collective or as an organization to do the justice work we're doing.
Excellent, great, thank you. And I'm going to choose another table. Why don't we hear from 14? One thing that came out of your conversation.
Some people will take the expanded awareness of intersectionality of various groups' needs, especially framed around tonight's focus on access for all, and take that into their own.
Excellent, great, thank you. All right, now we're going to move on to the next question, and then we're going to have some opportunity to talk about that as well. So, as Colette talked about earlier, and I've referred to this concept of a 2.0 training. So in the next round, for folks that want to continue to build their organizing skills, what specific social justice organizing skills would be helpful in the work that you are doing or would like to do? So we're asking you to think a little skills-based. What's missing from your tool belt that you'd really like to have? We would love to have a list compiled. And by the way, all of this is going to go up on Wigio, right? So we're going to be able to see with nobody's name attached, don't worry. But we will have this up there. So we have a running list of things, skills that we're looking to build collectively. All right, thanks Jess for flipping that slide there. Excellent. All right, so why don't you take some time at your tables and then we'll open it back up again. I can see it, lots of energy. All right. So I would love to hear from a couple of the tables, one or two skill sets that you identify as collectively important in our next incarnation here that you'd like to have in your tool belt. Any volunteers here? Yes. Table 7.
We wrote your own program.
Oh, we have no work to do. They've written the program, they say. Excellent.
One of the things we thought is like I kept asking what pansexual was, because no one at my table when you first said it knew what it was. And we thought it'd be really nice if you guys created an in-depth glossary of terms and what
Okay.
everything meant.
Did everybody hear that? Okay, so an example was at some points throughout Change U, the word pansexual was used, an example. And so some folks had not been familiar with that term. So one of the suggestions this group has made is that as we move along, we create a glossary of terms. Excellent. Do we have a mic here that maybe we can move around? Mia, do you still have your mic?
Oh, I'm sorry,
No,
yes.
no, no.
This way, folks, everybody can hear.
Okay. Do you have another one?
I identified as pan when I first came out. Don't have anything, you don't limit yourself in any way. Like, you're open to staging
Hello.
Thanks to body.
We thought it'd be really good to have a hands-on experience where you do an actual project.
Like here's what
Excellent. Great. Yes, we are thinking about that for 2.0. Thank you. Okay, other volunteers. Table 10, right here.
We have a couple. You said learning more ways to bridge gaps, such as generational, political, religious gaps.
Mm-hmm.
Moving away from theory to more practice focus, and then how to communicate and effectively utilize allies.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you. Let's take one or two more. Any other table wanna? Yes, table 5. Thanks, Tim.
We talked about the need to learn how to kind of talk to the institution, like colleges and things like that, about taking the social justice issues upon themselves as opposed to seeking students or other organizations to do it.
Speaking truth to power, for sure. Thank you for offering that. One more. Let's take one more. Over here. What table do we have? Can't see your number. 8? 8. Excellent.
I don't really have a neat way of articulating this, but it's a greater understanding of legislative process from sort of working from grassroots to policy.
Mm-hmm. Great. Excellent. Thank you. We have one more over here in the back. We'll take one more in the back.
We said we wanted to do a project like that Mia did with the event that you were at in Detroit. So actually kind of getting together with a group of people, and so really trying, I mean, when you talked about that, you were like, your eyes were like sparkly. And so, you know, to kind of have that experience in this collective group, so that's what our table's saying.
Excellent. So a collective creating access project. Excellent. Great. Great. Well, thank you so much. Oh, we have a burning over here. Okay, last one. Yes.
Ours follows up really nicely with that. We were thinking, we had a need for better networking opportunities and collaboration. So if we could organize the tables in focus areas and stay together the whole time and hopefully, you know, brainstorm together and build relationships and carry that into our future decision making. So I mean, it's good getting to know a whole variety of people, but to really kind of start creating together in this process.
Almost like the pods that Mia was talking about. Oh, we have another pod idea. Yeah. Okay, how many of you came up with pods? Let's see the hands. Oh, lots of pods. See, Mia? You've given them ideas. It's great already. All of us. All right, excellent. So we're going to go on to the third question now. And actually, Tim, could I see that? Because the third question is not on the page. Excellent, thanks. So we know that people are, oops. Okay. We know that people are doing important justice work in our area. We also know that alone we cannot achieve a lot. How important will it be to continue to challenge one another to achieve more highly intersectional work? If we are able to convene a monthly or bi-monthly meeting for the purpose of informing one another about our work as well as continue to encourage and challenge one another, how interested would you be in figuring out ways to work together on various justice issues to build cross-issue solidarity? So we're trying to gauge not only your interest, but also if there are ideas for ways to convene on a monthly basis. Do you want to convene around a topic? Do you want to convene around a particular movement? So folks in the environmental justice movement will meet one week, and folks in reproductive justice will meet, and then at times many folks will meet across movement. So is there a kind of a structure, a process, a set of ideas you have about how you will meet? So number one, topics. Well, number one is your interest. Number two is topics. And number three, do you have some sort of ideas for structure and containers for how you will meet? Okay? How does that sound? All right. We'll get you back together in about 10 or 15 minutes. Welcome back. And get them down all on paper because we want all of them. We're going to use as many of the ideas as possible. Okay, so let's hear from some of the tables. We have topics, structure, and if you're interested, willing, committed to monthly conversation. What's gauging interest? All right, table. What table is this here?
We're table one.
Number one, okay. Bring it on.
We got one, so we're gonna give it. One of the topic that we came up with was how class perpetuates continued oppression.
Excellent. How class, can we repeat that? I want to make sure we get.
How class perpetuates continued oppression.
Great. All right, over here, this table over here, which I can't see your number. Right here. 12.
We talked about part 2 being kind of the let's do it right here session, and highlighting local stories of people doing really amazing things that we might not hear about or even appreciate at this point. But there are people who have been working for 10, 20 years, and they have made tremendous changes. And could we do case study profiles where they get all the players, like we said, Kids Holiday Food Basket, neighborhoods, get all the players up there, tell the story, and then discuss.
Excellent. Yeah, that's really great. And you know, one of the things that this training has allowed us to do this first round is to find some of those people and to unearth those stories. So some of the reason why we did this year this way is we wanted to start to identify and map and start to find as many as people as possible so that we could continue to unearth those local stories. So thank you, that's great. Definitely want to build on that, for sure. Yes, table 14.
I appreciated being together with everyone in the cross kind of issue work, but I'd also appreciate an opportunity just to work with folks around my issue, which is disability, for some strengthening, collaborative work and support so that we could then move into some more cross-issue, intersectional work. So to move from here into identifying, again, some folks around specific issues as well as moving into cross-issue work.
Absolutely great, thank you, that's wonderful.
And on that note, is it possible at the end of this, because people have to leave, could you say anyone who would like to meet and talk about one issue can set aside tables so that people can?
Colette, there may be some capacity to actually do that on Wigio. That's what so that actually there's running lists of who's interested in what dialogues, and then you can actually use Wigio to connect, but also have each other's phone number, email address, which Wigio allows us to do. Is that a useful?
Face-to-face is more powerful, is more relational.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we will try to find a way at the end where folks can maybe do a little bit of networking. I want to make sure we have time for Colette to do some closing, and then we'll figure out some ways to do that. We'll put some thinking into it. 16. I know 16 had something over here. Did you have your hands up over here?
Oh,
Yeah.
I guess, just piggybacking off what he said, also being able to have time to speak with our speakers, because they come and they unload this information, then they disappear. I mean, of course you have their contact information, but like today, like, I really love everything. You were wonderful. Just being able to have that opportunity to like really pick her brain on like key things that she said and stuff like, I keep saying she, I'm so sorry. And just being able to speak with our speakers, because once they come and present, it's kind of like we're just left with a lot of information and not being able to follow up or that type of stuff.
Absolutely, great. Thank you. All right, I'll take one more, and then I'm gonna turn it over to Colette. Anything else? Okay, we'll take 7, and then we'll close.
We said to conduct like bi-monthly or monthly webinars on different, because a lot of people can't come together, especially if you're in the nonprofit sector, you can't schedule time, and then, maybe doing it at Colette's office or something.
Great, excellent. And that may be a way to bring back some of our speakers, is through webinars. Bring back some of our speakers. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all for these great ideas. We take, like I said, take them very seriously. We will be collecting them. Sandra, there's folks with baskets. Do you want to show your basket here? There's Sandra. So please deposit your notes there. It's been an honor and privilege to be with all of you for the last 5 months, and I'm going to turn things back over to Colette to close us out. Thank you.
So for what you've written down tonight, we're going to go ahead and upload those to Wigio. So we would ask that you make sure that we get them, and that if you can help us in any way with legibility, we'd really appreciate that too. About a week ago, I uploaded a roster of participants' names, organization, if that was applicable, email addresses, and phone numbers. So that is available on Wigio for you already. So I invite you to use Wigio to keep in touch with each other and to continue the conversation. And it sounds like Alan will be continuing conversations right afterwards, so catch up with him. And on the Saturday that we met for the first time, I opened up with a Melville quote that is really important to me and reminds me of how my liberation is deeply tied to the liberation of others, and I'd like to end by sharing that with you again. We cannot live for ourselves alone. Our lives are connected by 1,000 invisible threads, and along these sympathetic fibers, our actions run as causes and return to us as effects. And I hope that we leave with that, a deeper understanding of that. I'd like to thank Mia again for her fabulous presentation tonight. And Lisa for all her months of hard work. And then each one of you, thank you so much for your participation, for sharing yourselves, for pushing yourself to the next level. And we look forward to great things from our Change You alums. Thank you.